Picture the busiest oil choke point on the entire planet, a strip of water barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, squeezed between the southern coast of Iran and the tip of Oman. Roughly one-fifth of all the oil traded by sea on Earth passes through this single channel every single day. And this week, the President of the United States looked at that channel and basically said, if Iran doesn't sign a final deal within 60 days, the United States will start charging tolls on ships moving through it. Iran's answer didn't take a paragraph. It didn't take a press conference. It took two words: no tolls. That's the entire response. No qualifiers, no diplomatic cushioning, no we'll consider it. Just a flat, blunt rejection, aimed directly at the idea that Washington gets to put a price tag on water Iran has spent decades treating as its own front yard. If you think this is a throwaway line buried in a much bigger war, you are underestimating exactly how much weight is sitting on this one sentence right now. To understand why a single word like tolls can rattle markets and trigger this kind of reaction, you have to rewind to where this all started. Back in February, the United States and Israel launched what the Trump administration called major combat operations against Iran, hitting military sites, government targets, and infrastructure across the country. Iran responded with its own barrage, missiles and drones flying not just at Israel, but toward American bases scattered across the Gulf. What followed was months of a brutal, grinding standoff, a ceasefire here, a collapse there, talks in Pakistan that went nowhere, a naval blockade that Trump extended indefinitely, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, Iran did something that should have been the headline of the entire war and somehow wasn't treated like one. It began controlling who gets to use the Strait of Hormuz at all. Think about that for a second. This is supposed to be international water, a shared artery for global trade. And yet, for stretches of this war, Iran has effectively run it like a toll booth of its own, deciding which flags get to pass and which don't. Chinese-owned vessels moving through without trouble. Vessels tied to the United States, Israel, or their close allies getting turned away or threatened. At one point, ships were broadcasting their ownership status just to get clearance, announcing to the world that they were Chinese-owned or Turkish-operated, almost like a password to get through a checkpoint, a blockade within a blockade. The US trying to choke off Iranian oil exports, and Iran, in response, choking off who gets to move through the very water that everyone else depends on. Think about what enforcing a toll on a strait you don't control would actually require in practice. You'd need a naval presence capable of stopping or inspecting commercial vessels, a legal framework that some other country or international body actually recognizes, and a payment system that shipping companies would feel safe complying with instead of just quietly rerouting around. None of that exists right now in any usable form. The closest comparison is probably the sanctions regime the United States already runs against Iranian oil exports, the kind of pressure that works through banks and insurers and shadow fleets, rather than warships parked in the water. If tolls ever became real, they'd almost certainly look more like that, a financial squeeze enforced through paperwork and threats of secondary sanctions, rather than literal toll booths floating somewhere in the Gulf. Which means the 60-day deadline might be less about building an actual mechanism and more about generating exactly the kind of headline you're listening to right now, designed to make Tehran feel the clock ticking, even if the enforcement plan is still mostly conceptual. And the markets have already been reacting to less than this. Oil prices have spiked above $100 a barrel at multiple points since this war began, each time the strait situation worsened, only to ease back down once a ceasefire or a memorandum bought everyone a few weeks of calm. Analysts have repeatedly warned that the real danger isn't simply a shortage of oil somewhere in the world, since reserves can be tapped and rerouted. It's the difficulty of moving that oil safely once a major choke point becomes a war zone instead of a shipping lane. Every fresh headline about Hormuz closing again sends a small jolt through energy markets that are already exhausted from over a year of this whiplash, and a toll threat layered on top of an active closure is exactly the kind of combination that keeps traders up at night, rechecking shipping data instead of sleeping. None of this is actually new behavior from Iran, and that history matters if you want to understand why nobody in the shipping industry is taking any of this lightly. For decades, Tehran has treated the threat of closing Hormuz as one of its most reliable bargaining chips, long before this current war ever started. Every time sanctions tightened or tensions flared with Washington, the same warning would resurface from Iranian commanders: we can shut this down whenever we choose to. For most of that history, it stayed a warning, a card held but never actually played, because Iran also relies on that same water to sell its own oil. What makes this war different is that the warning finally turned into actual, repeated, on and off enforcement, which means the threat is no longer theoretical for anyone trying to insure a tanker or plan a shipping route through the region. So when this latest memorandum of understanding got signed, the one that was supposed to end the dual blockade and reopen the strait for everyone, you would think the story was over. It wasn't. Within days, maybe even hours, the cracks were showing. Trump signed the agreement at a dinner in France, sitting across from Macron in the middle of the G7 summit, and the ink was barely dry before Israel was back to hitting targets across southern Lebanon. Iran's response to that wasn't subtle. It shut the strait down again, calling the renewed strikes a direct violation of the understanding it had just signed with Washington. The Pentagon pushed back, insisting Iran doesn't actually have the operational control to close anything. But here's the thing about choke points. You don't need full legal control to make shipping companies terrified enough to reroute. Perception of danger is often just as effective as an actual blockade, and right now, perception is doing a lot of the work for Tehran. This is the exact moment Trump chose to drop the tolls threat, not in a vacuum, not as some abstract policy proposal, but directly in response to Iran shutting the strait down for what felt like the third or fourth time in this entire conflict. The framing from the American side was almost transactional, like a landlord threatening a tenant who's behind on rent. 60 days, reach a final deal, or the United States starts treating this stretch of water as if it's subject to American-imposed fees. It's a strange threat when you actually sit with it, because the United States doesn't own the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody does, in the traditional sense. It's a strait used under international maritime law, bordered by Iran on one side and Oman on the other, with shipping lanes that pass through both nations' territorial waters. The idea of Washington unilaterally imposing tolls on a waterway it doesn't control, doesn't border, and has no historical claim over is less a legal proposal and more a signal that says we can make this expensive for you no matter what the law actually says. And that's exactly why Iran's response mattered so much. 2 words: no tolls. Not we reject this proposal, or this violates international maritime law, or any of the longer, more diplomatically padded responses you'd expect from a foreign ministry trying to look measured on the world stage. Just a blunt, almost dismissive refusal. It reads less like a counteroffer and more like someone laughing off a threat they don't think is enforceable in the first place. And honestly, there's a strategic logic to answering that way. The moment you engage with a threat, point by point, you're implicitly accepting that it's a serious proposal worth debating. By reducing it to 2 words, Iran effectively told the world, this isn't worth our time, and it shouldn't be worth yours either. But strip away the bravado for a second, because there's something deeper happening underneath this exchange. The tolls threat isn't really about money. The United States is not desperate for toll revenue from a shipping lane on the other side of the world. What it's actually trying to do is reframe the entire conversation around control. If America can credibly threaten to impose fees on a strait it doesn't own, the subtext is that Washington still believes it has leverage over global trade routes, even when its actual military and legal footing in the region has weakened. Iran's 2-word rejection, in turn, is doing the same thing in reverse. It's not really about whether tolls would be collected or enforced. It's a way of saying, we are still the ones who decide what happens in this water, not you. Now zoom out, because this fight over a strip of ocean is rippling through economies that have nothing to do with the war itself. China sources somewhere around a third to 40% of its oil through Hormuz, and Chinese state-owned tankers have been some of the very first vessels willing to test the waters, literally sailing through, even while Western shipping companies kept their distance. That's not a coincidence. Iran has leaned on China as its most reliable buyer throughout this entire war, and in return, Chinese vessels have often gotten smoother passage than anyone else's. Every time the strait closes and reopens, China's energy security becomes a live question again, and every time it reopens selectively, you have to ask who's actually benefiting from the chaos. A closed strait that still lets Chinese tankers through isn't really closed in any meaningful economic sense. It's targeted. Then there's the human cost sitting quietly underneath all of this. The part that almost never makes it into the headlines about tolls and memorandums and diplomatic shuttle trips. Tens of thousands of sailors have been effectively stranded across the Persian Gulf region during the worst stretches of this crisis, many of them from India, stuck on ships that can't safely move forward or back. Some have described the experience as feeling like being in jail, trapped on a vessel with no clear timeline for when the danger passes. Cruise lines pulled ships out of the region entirely at various points, leaving thousands of passengers scrambling for alternative travel plans. These are the people who never get a seat at the negotiating table in Switzerland, who never get quoted in a memorandum of understanding, but who are living the most immediate physical consequences of a fight over who controls 21 miles of water. Europe has its own version of this anxiety, just dressed up in a different currency. A meaningful share of the world's liquefied natural gas moves through Hormuz as well, and every time the strait becomes a flashpoint again, gas markets in Europe flinch. Qatar, one of the largest LNG exporters on the planet, has had to declare force majeure on certain shipments during the most dangerous stretches of this conflict, which is industry language for "we cannot guarantee we can deliver what we promised, because the world around us has become too unpredictable." If you're sitting in a country that depends on that gas to heat homes and run factories through the winter, a phrase like "Iran closes the strait again" stops being a foreign policy headline and starts being a household budget problem. So when Trump puts a 60-day countdown on the table, he's not just threatening Iran directly, he's threatening the patience of every government and energy company watching this play out from a distance. 60 days is short enough to create pressure, but long enough to leave room for the kind of last-minute diplomatic theater this entire war has been built on. And if you've been paying attention to the pattern here, you'll notice that almost every deadline in this conflict has worked exactly the same way. Build-up, brinkmanship, a flurry of meetings in places like Islamabad or Switzerland, a dramatic signing ceremony, and then, almost immediately, some new flashpoint emerges that threatens to blow the whole thing up again. Lebanon has been that flashpoint more often than anything else. That's the part that makes this particular crisis so unstable. The headline fight is supposedly between Washington and Tehran, but the trigger for nearly every recent escalation has actually been Israel's continued strikes inside Lebanon, hitting what it describes as Hezbollah targets even after ceasefires have technically been agreed to. Israel has made clear, repeatedly, that it doesn't consider itself fully bound by the broader US-Iran memorandum, and that disconnect has put the Trump administration in an uncomfortable position. On one hand, it wants to claim credit for ending a brutal war through diplomacy. On the other hand, its closest regional ally keeps doing exactly the kind of thing that gives Iran the excuse it needs to shut the strait down again, undermining the very deal Washington just signed. This is why you're seeing real strain in the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu play out in public in a way that would have been unthinkable not long ago. Reports describe an American president increasingly frustrated with an Israeli prime minister who appears to be operating on his own political clock rather than Washington's diplomatic one. Netanyahu is heading into an election later this year and needs the support of hardline factions inside his own coalition to survive politically. factions that have been openly critical of any deal with Iran and have pushed for continued military pressure on Hezbollah, regardless of what Washington has signed off on. Every time Israeli strikes continue despite a ceasefire, it's not just a battlefield decision, it's a domestic political calculation with consequences that ripple all the way back to a strait of water on the other side of the region. There's also a quieter, less flattering layer to Iran's confidence that's worth sitting with. Multiple reports over the course of this war have described real strain inside Iran's own military, frontline units dealing with serious shortages of ammunition and basic supplies, and pockets of desertion as morale frays under the weight of a prolonged conflict. If even part of that picture is accurate, it complicates the simple story of Iran as an unshakable strategic operator calmly toying with Washington's threats. A country managing real cracks within its own armed forces still has every reason to project total confidence on the world stage, because appearing strong is sometimes the only leverage left when the underlying reality is far messier than a two-word soundbite lets on. That doesn't make the no tolls response empty bravado, but it does mean you shouldn't take it purely at face value either. Inside the United States, the deal itself isn't exactly enjoying universal support either. Several Republican senators have publicly pushed back against the broader memorandum, raising concerns about a law from 2015 that requires congressional approval for agreements involving Iran's nuclear program. That's a meaningful wrinkle, because it means the deal Trump is touting as finished business might not actually be as finished as it sounds in a press release. If Congress decides it has a formal role to play here, the 60-day toll threat and the broader nuclear negotiations both become entangled in a domestic political fight that has nothing to do with Tehran or Tel Aviv at all, and everything to do with Washington's own internal power struggles. Which brings us back to that two-word answer, because once you understand everything sitting underneath it, it stops looking like an offhand dismissal and starts looking like a calculated bet. Iran is betting that the United States doesn't actually have a clean, enforceable way to impose tolls on water it doesn't legally control, especially not within 60 days, especially not while Israel keeps reigniting the exact instability that gives Iran cover to control the strait in the first place. Iran is also betting that China, its most reliable customer throughout this entire war, will keep buying oil and keep moving tankers through regardless of how loudly Washington talks about fees and deadlines. And it's betting that global energy markets, already exhausted from over a year of volatility, gas shortages, and emergency reserve releases, simply don't have the appetite for a fresh shock over something as symbolic as a toll booth that may never actually get built. Whether that bet pays off depends almost entirely on what happens in the next 2 months, and there are really only a few ways this goes from here. One path is that the negotiations happening right now in Switzerland actually produce something durable, a real ceasefire that holds in Lebanon, a nuclear framework that survives contact with Congress, and a Strait of Hormuz that stays open for everyone instead of just for Tehran's preferred trading partners. If that happens, the toll threat quietly disappears the way so many dramatic deadlines in this war already have, remembered mostly as a tense moment in a much longer story rather than the spark for anything bigger. The second path is messier. Israel keeps striking inside Lebanon regardless of what Washington wants. Iran keeps using the strait as leverage every time that happens, and somewhere around the 60-day mark, the United States has to decide whether it's actually willing to act on its own threat, or whether the toll idea quietly gets walked back without ever being enforced. If Washington blinks, it sends an unmistakable signal to Tehran that these kinds of deadlines are mostly theater, which would make every future threat in this conflict significantly less credible. If Washington somehow does try to enforce something resembling tolls, you're looking at a confrontation over the legal status of one of the most strategically important waterways on the planet, one that draws in Oman, draws in China, and almost certainly draws in a furious response from Iran that goes well beyond a two-word statement. There's a third possibility too, one that doesn't get talked about as much but probably deserves more attention than it gets. China has every incentive in the world to make sure this entire toll dispute never escalates into something that disrupts its own oil supply. Beijing has already shown through quiet diplomatic involvement in earlier ceasefire efforts that it's willing to nudge things towards stability when its own energy security is on the line. Don't be surprised if, somewhere behind the scenes of this 60-day countdown, there's a version of this story being shaped less by Washington and Tehran directly and more by what Beijing is willing to tolerate before it starts applying its own pressure to keep the oil moving. If you want concrete signposts instead of just vibes, here's what's actually worth watching over the coming days. Watch whether the talks happening in Bergenstock produce anything beyond another round of vague optimism, because Iran's own negotiators have made clear that Lebanon, not the nuclear file, is what they consider the real sticking point right now. Watch what happens with the soldier casualties on both sides, because every name added to that list makes a clean diplomatic resolution politically harder for whoever's in charge. Watch oil prices for any sustained move back above that $100 mark, since that's usually the first sign markets think this is heading somewhere worse rather than somewhere calmer. And watch Congress, quietly, in the background, because a fight over who actually gets to approve this deal could end up mattering just as much as anything happening on the water itself. What makes this moment genuinely fascinating, if you step back far enough, is how much weight keeps getting placed on symbolism in a war that is, underneath everything, about extremely concrete things. Oil, money, military capability, political survival. And yet here we are, passing a two-word response to a tolls threat as if it's a chess move in some much larger game. Because in a strange way, it actually is. Wars like this one don't always get decided by the biggest strikes or the most dramatic battlefield moments. Sometimes they get decided by which side blinks first over something as seemingly small as who gets to charge a fee on a stretch of water that both sides know neither one can fully control without the other's cooperation. So here's the real question worth sitting with after all of this. Is no tolls actually a sign of strength, a confident rejection from a country that knows the threat against it is mostly bluff? Or is it a sign of just how cornered Iran feels, forced to respond to an economic threat with a defiant one-liner, because a longer, more substantive answer would require admitting just how much leverage it's actually lost over the course of this war? Both readings are plausible, and honestly, the truth is probably some uncomfortable mixture of the two. Iran has enough leverage left to make global shipping companies nervous and enough leverage left to keep China's tankers moving through safely, but it doesn't have enough leverage left to guarantee that a 60-day deadline won't eventually force its hand in ways a two-word statement can't paper over forever. What happens next genuinely isn't clear, and that's not a cop-out, that's the honest state of this conflict right now. The Strait has opened and closed more times in the last several months than most people can keep track of. Ceasefires have been signed, broken, and re-signed within the span of a single week. A memorandum that was supposed to end the dual blockade for good is already being tested by the exact regional dynamics it was meant to resolve. And now there's a ticking 60-day clock sitting on top of all of it, with a toll threat on one side and a two-word refusal on the other, both sides essentially daring the other to make the next move first. If you've been following this war from the beginning, you already know the pattern by now. Every time it looks like things are finally settling down, something happens in Lebanon, or on the water, or in a closed-door meeting in Switzerland, and the entire situation resets itself. Maybe this 60-day countdown ends quietly, swallowed up by the next news cycle the same way so many earlier deadlines have been. Or maybe this is the moment that actually forces a real decision, one way or the other, about who genuinely controls the Strait of Hormuz when push comes to shove. Either way, keep an eye on the next few weeks, because if there's one thing this entire war has proven, it's that the most consequential moves rarely come with a warning, and sometimes the loudest statement in the whole conflict is just two words long. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, the best thing you can do is stick around for what comes next, because this story is nowhere near finished. We've watched this same script play out again and again over the past several months. A deadline gets set, both sides posture, something in Lebanon blows it all up, and then everyone scrambles back to a negotiating table to start the cycle over. There's no reason to assume this 60-day window breaks that pattern, but there's also no guarantee it won't. And that uncertainty is exactly why this is worth following closely, instead of writing off as just another headline in a war that's already produced more headlines than anyone can count. Subscribe if you want to keep up with how this 60-day window plays out, because between Lebanon, the Strait, and whatever happens behind closed doors in Switzerland, there's a very real chance this entire situation looks completely different a month from now. And if you've got a take on whether no tolls is confidence or desperation, drop it in the comments, because honestly, that's the debate worth having right now.